इसका सबसे बड़ा लाभ हमारे देश के नौजवानों को होगा।
Joining me now is Dhruva Jayashankar, Executive Director of the Observer Research Foundation in America. Dhruva, good to see you. Thanks for your time here on NDTV. Interesting times with the trade deal now being announced. We still don't have the full picture and details are awaited. I hear we'll get more of that in a day or two. But my first question to you, Dhruva, is did this deal happen in your view because India and the Prime Minister, stayed calm through the turbulence, with President Trump? Or do you think it was because Trump ultimately needed India more than he admitted? Which one was it, straight off?
Look, I can't read President Trump's mind. I don't think many people can, even his close advisors. But I think we know a few things that happened. India had been asking for a deal, sort of a trade agreement, sort of offered one quite soon after his inauguration last year. And negotiations actually began in earnest. And so, if we rewound this to April of last year, we would have said that India would have been one of the first countries to get a comprehensive agreement. Then, of course, we had a sort of downturn in relations after Operation Sindoor. We had 9 months or so of a sort of frosty relationship. And now something has changed. I suspect, again, we can only speculate, that two factors at least played a role. One was India was showing that it was still open for business and conducting business as usual. It concluded trade agreements with the UK and with the European Union and New Zealand, and amongst others. And secondly, I think the idea that sort of it was not having an effect. We actually saw Indian exports to the US increase by about 26% last quarter over the year before. And US exports only grew 3%. So I think a combination that it was not really working and that obviously a lot of other things were being held back in the relationship because of differences over trade.
There was a sense, Dhruva, that this was going to take some time, maybe a few more months. For most people watching, it seemed to come out of nowhere when the president, dropped that comment on his social media. Was there a tipping point in your view, something specific, or was it a slow build-up and then it just happened? Or was there a more immediate sort of catalyst that created this breakthrough?
Again, we can only speculate. In hindsight, I think, we'll find out more in the next few months and years about, what actually perhaps happened and what motivated Trump to make the change, because it really was dependent on him. I mean, in many other people, even in December, the U.S. Trade Representative said that in a Senate hearing that India was offering the best deal ever. And so even people, the senior officials in the U.S. had accepted the fact that this was on the table for some time. And in July last year, actually, there was the two sides came very close to an announcement. The Commerce Minister, Piyush Goyal, today has clarified some of these issues. So I think, we don't know what was the tipping point, but I think a certain confluence of factors came together. One is, I think, again, enough time had elapsed. Two, Russian oil imports from India had come down, and India could say that has taken place. Three, we had personnel in place. You had a U.S. ambassador in place. You have an assistant secretary at the State Department. So I think all of those factors help. But ultimately, what pushed things over the edge is anyone's guess.
On the issue of Russian oil specifically, there continues to be a lack of, complete clarity. President Trump was very specific, of course, and we've heard from White House officials as well. On the Indian side, nothing specific just yet, except that, market prices and market forces will dictate how India purchases its oil. There was also a comment about how, India is committed to purchasing energy from non-sanctioned entities. How do you see that working out? Because that became one of the major sticking points in this entire process, Dhruva.
Yeah, but look, it's hard to say. I think the problem with oil and other commodities is that they actually function on a global in a global marketplace. And when there is a global shortage, India has to source oil from where it can, and that really has been the case the last few years. One of the factors I think that is changing is that there's a lot more oil coming online, particularly actually the Western Hemisphere. So from the US, Canada, Brazil, Guyana, Venezuela now possibly, and that is going to help sort of stabilize oil prices. Again, this could be thrown for a six by a lot of things, including what happens potentially in Iran and in the Gulf in the next few years. So I think, it's very hard to say because you have market forces at play.
One of the angles, Dhruva, that's been written about extensively over the last few months is that India has been pushing back on very key issues like agro and dairy and energy, like we just pointed out. Is that something that you think, in some ways did have an impact in these negotiations? India was a country that definitely drew a line and said, we are here to negotiate, but there are some things that we simply won't concede on.
No, I think absolutely. And again, Minister Piyush Goyal's statement today, again, clarified that a little bit. And again, we saw similar dynamic at play in the EU trade negotiations, which I think, frankly, many of us thought would be more difficult. But look, every country has its, red lines when it comes to trade negotiations. It's politically sensitive sectors. And I think trade negotiators have to keep that in mind and then reach compromise in other areas where they're able to make that compromise. But I think, again, the more trade, one of the, I think, the lessons is that the more trade deals you have, the more leverage you have with others, right? If you had EU, from Europe, wines and whiskeys coming in, this would really be at the long term disadvantage of, for example, US exporters in those sectors. So I think, again, these external factors sometimes help clarify where negotiators can make certain trade-offs. But look, overall, I think all trade negotiations are difficult, and everyone understands that they have red lines. There's a famous, most trade negotiators know there's the Japanese rice farmers who are completely sacrosanct. They cannot be touched because they're politically so powerful, and every country has its equivalent of that.
In your view, zooming out just a little bit, Dhruva, does this mark, some kind of a shift for India from an earlier kind of dynamic which was, independent, non-alignment, to a more sort of unapologetic recognition that transactional geopolitics, is very much a reality?
I don't think that has changed in my view. Look, India has always been quite autonomous from independence and remains so, and I don't think that will change anytime. It's a large country with its own identity. I think the difference is, does your autonomy mean that you say no to opportunities that might be beneficial, or do you say yes to opportunities? And I think what we've seen, again, we've gone from a very, an idea of 10 years between 2014 and a little after that, where India did not conclude any trade agreements, to suddenly concluding 8 trade agreements since 2021, right? Yeah. So I think it is, let's seize the opportunities that present themselves, because they actually make you stronger.
Speaking about, Prime Minister Modi and President Trump, two popular leaders, two leaders who've had, who have enjoyed big followings in their countries. What does this breakthrough, Dhruva, tell us about, their sort of relationship, their chemistry? Did that play a part in it? Because like you said, it's been a bit of a roller coaster arriving till this point. There have been conversations, there's been this periodic expression of warmth and affection, and we both know that that does play a part, but we did see some ups and downs.
Yes. No, absolutely. And I think particularly on the US side, I don't think we've had a situation where personalities matter to this extent. Obviously, the personality of the US president matters and the worldview of the US president, but I think to the same extent that it is really a signal to the larger system, to the bureaucracy, to the political leadership in his own country. So, again, the biggest significance of the announcement on Monday was Trump signaling on Truth Social that it is okay to do business with India. That is really, and now the details are being hashed out. I think we'll have the technical details. We'll wait for executive orders, a joint statement, I think, soon, which will offer a technical roadmap for implementation. But that, I think that personality does matter more than even more than in the past. And therefore, not just Prime Minister Modi, but many other countries have struggled with this issue, which is how do you engage with Trump personally? I mean, just to give a very different example, this week, the Colombian president was in town and they'd had a bit of a war on words on social media, but then they met in person and it seemed to be a much warmer and more constructive meeting. And so those personal engagements do matter. I think this did require a call from the Prime Minister. Nobody else could have gotten things over the line. It had to be the leader of the country. Obviously, I think in this day and age, it matters more than perhaps in the past.
Dhruva, you've had a ringside view of what's happening in Washington. And I completely agree with you. Nobody can really read what's happening on the US president's mind. But, post-Sindoor, when things sort of became frosty, How was it processing all of that? Much of it was unexpected. One expected a certain degree of alignment with India. We saw what happened with Pakistan. What was it like looking at all of that happen up close?
I think, from Trump's second inauguration to May 10th, end of Operation Sindoor, I think it had been apparent to many of us. In fact, I wrote something just a few days before Operation Sindoor by coincidence, which was that this idea of Trump being obsessed with or very concerned about his legacy and this idea of him as a peacemaker was taking priority over a lot of other engagements, including with China. So, the U.S. was in some ways downplaying some of the balance of power logic that was driving the U.S.-India relationship because of Trump's idea that he wanted to settle disputes between the U.S., Europe, and Russia, in Gaza, between the U.S. and China even. And we're still seeing elements of that at play. So I think, we saw that coming. I think the extent of it has surprised a lot of people. And it's not just with India, even with, the sort of remarkable message that Trump sent to the Prime Minister of Norway about the Nobel Peace Prize and how that influenced his engagement with Europe. So again, I think some of that was coming. I think the extent of it was quite surprising. And yet again, over the last few months, you did see a defense framework agreement signed between the two countries. You had a major gas deal signed at the end of the year. You've had AI investments from U.S. entities into India despite the tariffs. And so a lot of the normalcy kind of continued under the political level. But at the same time, we didn't have any cabinet level engagement, at least from the U.S. to India, since March of last year, I believe. So again, I think, again, on the one hand, it has been a very strange period because it has been so individualized, again, more than in the past. And yet again, that sort of normal structural engagement had continued in many ways.
Dhruva Jaishankar, a pleasure to have you with me here on NDTV. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shiv.
Live now is one of the world's foremost economists, public policy commentators, Columbia University professor, Jeffrey Sachs. Professor Sachs, always a pleasure to have you here on NDTV. Thank you very much for being with me here once again. This is, of course, on the back of Trump and then India confirming that they've arrived at a trade deal. We still don't know what the contours of the deal are, but there's much to talk about, not just about the journey till this point, but also what has been said so far and how we understand it. So my first question to you, Professor Sachs, do you see this as a thaw or some kind of a time out? Lots of optics. Do you see this as a trade breakthrough, a genuine reset, or a temporary ceasefire of sorts?
I think it's probably likely to last because what Trump is doing is backing down from his wars, trade wars all over the world. This is part of that backing down. In other words, Trump came out, guns blazing several months ago, not only against India, but all over the world. He's backing down step by step. So this is basically part of a retrenchment of U.S. policy.
Who do you think conceded? You're saying that this was Trump climbing down. Behind the press releases, which side do you think gave up more? We still don't know, I should say once again, what exactly the details are.
Exactly. We don't know, but I would say in general, the U.S. backed down because, after all, the day before yesterday, the tariff rates were 50%. Now they're 18%. The 50% never made sense. This was a blunder by the United States. Trump's mouth works a lot faster than his brain, and that was what happened in that case. Now the U.S. is basically backed down. There's fine print we don't know, but essentially what happened is the U.S. came out with very high tariffs against many countries. Against India was a big surprise because it violated every strategic principle that should have applied. But now Trump has backed down here as well as in other cases.
Trump has been very clear to say that this is a win for America. In your assessment, Professor Sachs, are these wins sustainable economic outcomes or short-term deals that leave, long-term distortions in their wake? Even members of the White House have, doubled down on the $500 billion figure, which has made a lot of people raise their eyebrows here.
Well, I don't think that anything that Trump says is honest. So there's a lot of bluster. Trump says that trillions and trillions have been promised by other countries. This is basically Trump running off at the mouth. He is an unstable and not very bright person, I have to say. And so we hear a lot of things that simply aren't true. And a lot of the big headlines are just announcements that make him feel good, but that don't really add anything in substance to economic life. All of these promises of who's going to buy what from whom, this has no basis in general. When Trump says that trillions and trillions of dollars have been promised to the U.S. economy. Maybe it is other leaders sweet-talking him. Maybe he's not very bright. I don't know what it is, but I don't count it for very much.
What do you make of India's leverage that was used in these negotiations? Do you think that it offers up a big opportunity? China is constrained, Professor Sachs, and supply chains are shrinking. Is this the strongest hand India has held, in your view, in terms of a global trade negotiation? It's unprecedented what we saw.
I don't think that the U.S. market is so important for India in the future. This may sound surprising because the U.S. Has been the goal, replace China in the value chain. But the U.S., while it's a rich economy, accounts for maybe 12% of global trade right now, and it's a slow-growing economy. The big growth is your neighborhood.
Yeah.
The big growth is Southeast Asia. The big growth is China, because India and China should be trading with each other. The big growth is in Western Asia, where there's a lot of money in the Gulf. Africa will grow rapidly. So India shouldn't base too much on the U.S. market. It's slow growing and our politics are unstable. Whereas it's the emerging economies, the BRICS economies, that are going to be the dynamic economies of the future.
Much of this this journey towards this trade deal over the last 8 to 9 months, Professor Sachs, has been about Trump and Modi. Both are outsized personalities, very popular in their countries, but conspicuously, Prime Minister Modi here has refused to publicly spar with Trump, even under all this tariff pressure, even in the face of some provocations and some taunts and mocks and things like that. How do you see that? Was that strategic maturity to, just wait it out and let the negotiations happen? Or do you think it may have signaled to Washington and to Trump specifically that pressure actually works?
Well, first, it's not quite the case that both are popular. Prime Minister Modi is very popular, but President Trump is not very popular. Prime Minister Modi's approval ratings are in the 70s or 80s, whereas President Trump's approval ratings are in the 30s. His disapproval ratings are in the 50s. So Trump is an unpopular figure, by and large, because we see him for what he is. He's a rather unstable, rude, crude, not very bright guy. This is a big problem. I think that Prime Minister Modi behaved politely. He behaved circumspectly. He got the deal that is pretty good for India in the end, and that is an accomplishment. But the stakes for India are much bigger than the U.S.-Trump issue. India is the presidency of the BRICS this year. That's half the world population. That's basically half the world GDP at this point. So I think Prime Minister Modi's stature is very high, but what's important is that it is good with China, with Russia, with the Southeast Asia, with the African Union. And that is going to prove to be the more important point, not the bilateral relationship of Prime Minister Modi and a rather unpopular and unstable figure in the United States.
And this is going to be a difficult tightrope walk, as you may understand, Professor Sachs, better than anyone else, for India at a time when geopolitics has hijacked global trade, if I may use that word, more than ever before in our lifetime, certainly. So I'm wondering whether India can, in your view, deepen these economic ties with the United States without sliding into a sort of anti-China economic bloc. How do you think India is going to play that tightrope?
I think that's extremely important, what you've just said. India should not allow itself to be used by the United States as an anti-China bludgeon. This is how American leaders think about India. They don't think about India, they think about anti-China. And I've often advocated that India should not be part of the so-called Quad arrangement, for example, which is the United States and India, Japan, and Australia against China. India is just too big, too important, too major a country to be used by another country. It should have its own independent foreign policy that, in my view, should be absolutely on normal relations with China and the United States and Russia, and not allow the United States to try to use India against Russia or against China.
Yeah. Final question, Professor Sachs, is the issue of Russian oil, where Trump and members of his team have said that India is committed to stop buying Russian oil, which is not true. And that goes to the point where you said that not everything that comes out of President Trump and the White House can be fully trusted or authenticated. And we're hearing from our government that that's actually not true. India will continue to get its energy depending on market prices. It will keep people's interests first. But it has committed, however, to purchasing energy from non-sanctioned entities. This is also a bit of a tightrope walk, you believe, because Trump has made it a sort of key issue for trade negotiations to move forward, the whole Ukraine war and Russian oil item.
First, the Ukraine war was started by the United States by pushing NATO enlargement. It was not started by Russian provocation. It was started by the United States. So this has been a U.S. geopolitical game. Second, these sanctions are U.S. sanctions. They're not UN sanctions. And the U.S. does not have the right to dictate world trade terms. This, in my view, is why the BRICS are so important. The BRICS as a group should say to the United States, no, you keep your sanctions to yourself. We'll trade as we see fit. We'll do it politely, but you cannot dictate world trade terms. You cannot dictate how we trade with each other. This is a very basic point that I think is very important for the BRICS countries.
Final question, Professor Sachs. How does India emerge from these negotiations looking? The simple way that a lot of people here look at it is that India has held on to its demands. It stood up to a proverbial bully. It has refused to give concessions despite a lot of American pressure. Your view of how India has ended up looking?
This is a fine agreement. It's what maturity brings about. India was just steadfast. It's no miracle. It's no strategic alliance with the United States. It is what it is. The U.S. has backed down from outrageous claims that it made last year. That's a good thing.
Professor Jeffrey Sachs, always a pleasure. Thank you very much for speaking to NDTV.